on the other one, you bastard!
Brought to you by supporters who probably have better taste than this schmuck.
Last year, I had the displeasure of taking a look at one of Earthrise's many lukewarm offerings, WFC-GS21 Starscream. He wasn't a bad figure per se, but there were just so many compromises here and there, and the end result ended up being ridiculously lukewarm. Actually, that's a bit of an oxymoron, ridiculously and lukewarm. The disappointment in the mold was amplified when it came off the back of one of the best Seeker molds in the past decade, and it was amplified even further with the release of Studio Series Blitzwing, Kingdom Starscream, and Studio Series Bumblebee Starscream soon after. 4 great to amazing molds surrounding this figure, and this is what Hasbro considers to be the poster child of the Seekers. Mate. But of course, despite every lineup starting off with Starscream, he really is one of the most boring colour schemes. He may not be the weakest of the bunch, but there are always better colour schemes out there. And hey, at least this time with the mold, they're giving some more obscure characters some love. Like, just take a look at the G2 representation. Now that's something to get excited for. We're finally getting one of the unreleased colours in plastic form. It's amazing! Somehow it's worse! Greetings, Cybertronians, I'm DrLockdown, and today's diagnosis pertains to Generation Select's WFC-GS21 Sandstorm. So quick background, and I really do mean quick, because there's not a lot to say about the lead up to this fella. No, Sandstorm doesn't share any relations to the Autobot Triple Changer. He's one of 2 unreleased Generation 2 Seekers, along with Blackout. Yes, I think the name is more fitting for a helicopter too, but that's beside the point. Bringing an unreleased concept to life is always an alluring one. Hell, Fun Publications practically wrote the book on such. As ludicrous as a sand camouflage jet may seem, especially since deserts are usually flat, so you could easily see a jet in the sky at any given time.
And the Sand Guardian, Guardian of the Sun.
Generation 2 already holds a lot of love within today's fandom. It doesn't matter that it almost killed the franchise due to its poor marketing, and no, I'm not exaggerating, I'm being completely literal. It barely lasted 2 years, and Beast Wars was a throwaway line at first. And I just realized that was a run-on sentence. Fuck me. Anyway, doesn't matter that it almost killed the franchise. People like myself love the designs to this day, and coupled with the elusiveness of the concept, it was a recipe for success. Well, at least in the marketing sense, because both Megatron and Sandstorm seem to be selling gangbusters, but in actual tangible plastic form, yeesh, this is pretty bad. Now, to be frank, I never really disliked the original Earthrise Starscream jet mode. It was acceptable and probably on the same level as the Siege version in terms of quality. It had its issues, don't get me wrong, but it was aesthetically pleasing to say the least. This is actually bad. I get what it's trying to be, fitting into the Ramjet type pretty snugly. The idea behind it makes perfect sense, but there are so many minor annoyances that add up to an overall experience that makes me flip the bird and tell it to piss off. The first thing you'll probably notice is the colors, and in photography it looks alright, but in person it's extremely haphazard. The reddish brown is incredibly inconsistent, to the point where one side ends up being darker than the other. The darker brown specs are pretty crisp, but the white paint is awful. It legitimately looks like someone went in with liquid paper and splooged the bottle all over it. There's parts where it's applied properly and parts where the painter fell asleep. It doesn't even continue the whole way. The legs are completely left untouched, which makes the design look incredibly segmented. And sure, repro labels can fix it, but as I said in the last review, upgrade should make a good figure better, not fix a shit one. I get what they're trying to reference, and to an extent they're being absurdly accurate, but they're doing so to a hand-painted prototype. This was never meant to be the final product, so this is one instance where I think a few liberties should have been taken. That's not to say liberties haven't been taken, nor that some color choices aren't actually quite good. They've cleaned up the face of the front of the nose cone, and whilst it's a little annoying that it doesn't go the whole way, the black spot looks pretty ruddy cool. I also love the neon orange they chose, which doesn't match the gold on the original prototype or the yellow on the artwork, and you know what? Good, this looks better. Quick question though, where's the line paint? Did they waste all the budget on the wings? Oh yeah, great thing to waste the budget on. It totally looks better than Maverick's camo paint. Actually, that might be a bit harsh. Maverick did have better paint, but the plastic sure as hell fell below. But beyond coloration issues, the overall design is just off. It was hard to put my finger on, but bringing him next to the old Classics mold, which shares the same Ramjet heritage, you can definitely tell something's missing. It's not the length or the width, something else is off. So I started taking a look at other Ramjet photos, and it hit me. There's usually an indent in the angle. It's also present on select Sandstorm, but it's at a far too obtuse angle for it to really affect the design, not to mention it's way too far forward. You've also got it curving inwards towards the front, and the result is that it just makes the whole thing lose its swish nature. And look, I'm not a purist when it comes to reinterpretation. When you take a design and modernize it in a way that improves on the original, I'm all for it. The problem is that here the change is just worse. I suppose it's fitting with the original molds, copying a mold without truly realizing what the main point is. And speaking of changes that make no sense, why the f do the tail fins fold inwards? Again, I'm no G1 or anything, but this just looks bad. You've got the jet slowly angling outwards, albeit poorly in some areas, and then this draws your attention in the opposite direction. What the f? Not to mention the beige paint is applied way too thinly and it looks like it was rushed. And what's the purpose of this? So the wings can sit flush with the legs? Why do they need to sit flush with the legs? Is leg kibble really the worst thing in the world? Again, I keep having to stress, I don't mind taking original designs and modernizing them. I love that shit most of the time. But in this case, they're fixing something that was a non-issue. Nobody was complaining about the wings on the back of the cone heads. In fact, in this case, it might have been better to just leave it as is for the sake of the robot mode, but we'll get to that later. In the meantime, the whole back section looks like they cobbled together a bunch of different jets at the last minute. When it came to the original Starscream version, I liked the way the feet worked. It was one of the few moments of brilliance that shined through with the design. So, why don't they work here? Well, on the original, they had extra tail fins to wrap around them. Here, they don't, and they almost end up looking naked. They just jut out way too conspicuously. Maybe if the wings were longer and maybe the feet were retooled a bit, it could have worked better, but this just doesn't fit. And what did they retool instead? Why, the kneecaps, of course. But oh look, now the whole thing wobbles around like an alcoholic in an all-you-can-drink pub night. And yes, I'm glad there's no paint chipping on the bottom, but fixing one issue only to add 16 more isn't something I like to see, thank you very much. Plus, thanks to this stupid addition, accessing the stand port becomes a pain in the ass. Again, this wasn't something that needed fixing. It's nice that they tried to retool it to match the Season 2 cartoon model, which I'll discuss more in the robot mode, but when it comes to the cost of original mold functionality, well, I think the designers can politely f*** off. And they didn't even bother retooling the null rays, so you can't see them from the underside. Between this and the stand port, it's reminding me a lot of last week's review subject. Only, you know, shit. Even the Classics version was able to do that back in the day. Why can't you put some goddamn effort in? And that's the problem. The retooling just feels half-assed here. It's like they rushed it out of the door because they wanted a ramjet on the shelf. Even though, ironically, he never was initially on any shelves. And the designer didn't give a flying f***. Look, I understand this is a 2020 mold. There were a bunch of external factors, such as the Covey-Wovey, that made development of Transformers and other action figures exceedingly difficult. Apparently, Megatron was never supposed to be a retool, and no designer wanted him to be, but decreased budgets forced their hands. But here's the thing, there weren't any issues with Starscream's vehicle mode, save for the paint chipping. It was, for the most part, a solid jet mode. It was fine. This went back and retroactively added a bunch of shit that just doesn't work, and they didn't have to. Every quote-unquote addition to this mode is done so poorly that ultimately it feels closer to a retooled knockoff than it does a collector-grade Transformer. And yes, this isn't mainline, this is collector-grade. Your average parent or kid isn't going out of their way to find this, so there's a smaller margin for leeway. Even then, there's an expectation for the more obscure seekers to have better colors than what's released in mainline, and for some dumb reason, it just isn't. This alt mode isn't truly terrible. There are a few things here and there that I do like, but ultimately it's just so half-assed and misguided. To be fair, that was the marketing motto for G2 itself, but it's not really something this jet mode should have embodied. Just as it shouldn't have remained so absurdly accurate to the poorly done prototype. But hey, maybe the jet mode serves the robot mode, right? Well, let's take a look. Now, in this episode, I'm going to tackle things a little differently. While I did go over the vehicle mode sizing, I won't be doing so with the transformation, articulation, and robot mode sizing, since they remain identical to Earthrise Starscream. As far as I can tell, there isn't really a point covering them again, it's just repeated information. It's just a waste of time, honestly. Still, the transformation is as unfinished as it was on the original. The chest and arms remain as awkward as they were, and the nose cone still does the bare minimum. Fortunately, I can say there's been one slight improvement. The knees do actually peg into place on the shins this time. Great. One small improvement. Very nice. What's not nice is the robot mode. I'm sorry, but this thing is bland as shit. The further up the body you go, the less interest you find in this design. The feet and the shins get some lovely black paint, and the knees get some passable off-white and red. Then the pelvis gets some brown to color correct, and then the turbines, I guess. By the time you reach the top, the whole thing is an unpainted mess. The arms basically have nothing on them, which itself would be fine if the plastic allowed such to look good. Unfortunately, this isn't the stone grey that Starscream used. This kind of color scheme needs breakup, otherwise it looks mundane. You even get baffling choices like painting the shoulder spikes in white, where they've done it so thinly you barely notice any differentiation in the color. But hey, red highlights, am I right? Yippee! That's not the most egregious aspect of this mode, though. If you thought the vehicle mode had bad proportions, well, you ain't seen nothing yet. So, you remember that really cursed photo of G1 Optimus Prime taking off his boots at the end of the day? This robot mode exudes that kind of energy. The original Earthrise Starscream is quite the chunky seeker, and I'm aware that's not typical for the character, but that wasn't one of the issues I took with him. The aesthetic, for the most part, worked, but Sandstorm spits in the face of all that. You've got a super bulky torso, then almost anorexic legs. It's almost as if they took the legs from the Siege version and transplanted them here. It's all thanks to two key changes. The first has already been discussed, the wings. The whole reason the jet mode looks so bad pad is so that the wings can sit flush against the legs, and, why do they even bother? What's wrong with them angling outwards? Again, they're fixing something that was a non-issue. Now, I'm not forgiving Starscream's horrid foot wings, but at the very least they bulked out the legs enough to make the aesthetic work better. Hell, they let the aesthetic work better on the Kingdom one, so the foot kerfuffle can work in some instances. Had these moved further forward, it could have worked far better. But here, while they are further up the legs so they don't clash with the foot, they've also been moved further back, and when combined with how flat it folds up, there's no outward bulk. I get that Seekers aren't meant to have bulk, but this Seeker mold does, so they should have adjusted accordingly. Furthermore, these new knee pads make the legs seem much flatter. I understand that the Season 2 character designs were made to be much more toy accurate, and I understand trying to offer some variety in design elements between the two deviations. The thing is, these new knee pads, coupled with the new wings, create an optical illusion that the legs are thinner than they actually are, and consequently the whole thing ends up being a hodgepodge of different aesthetics. Look, I'm not against retools as a concept. I know I talk the fandom for thinking everything somehow links back to Silverbolt in some regard, but many retools have given us truly remarkable experiences. Hell, there are retooled parts here that do actually turn out alright. You may not have noticed, but the entire chest has been redone, also to fit the Toon model closer. Whilst I do prefer the original design slightly more, this is a nice touch in its own right. The problem is that everything else sits comfortably between bad and mediocre. At least with Starscream I can point to the head sculpt, colors, and mechanical detail as defining positive elements with the mold. Sandstorm just doesn't have that. He lacks that one defining, shining moment. And even then, there's baggage from his predecessor that gets carried over. Oh no, Starscream, don't think you can get a pass now. You're half the reason why this Robo mode sucks so much to begin with. The chest is still ridiculously hollow. In fact, in these new colors, it's even more noticeable. Furthermore, there's still no waist swivel. I wouldn't expect him to add one in after all this time, but it's a problem that the original had, and as such it carries over. From what I hear in terms of leaks and rumors, the designers wanted to include a waist swivel, but just couldn't in terms of budgets. Oh, yes, that's totally to be relieved when every other Voyager in the trilogy bar Ape Face Incorporated were. And even after all that, there's still kerfuffles that have to be dealt with. You like bad QC? Well, boy, do I have a figure for you. My copy may have fixed the knee locking tabs, but it's still got stuck with a shoulder peg that's so loose I'm concerned it's going to fall out of its socket. Well, I say loose, but tolerance-wise, it's actually quite tight. What I mean to say is the actual peg holding it in place wobbles around, and it feels like I'm flexing the plastic whenever I move it. I think I might just not move that arm at all, to be honest. And on top of that, one of the null rays came with its own special little stress mark out of the box. It's bad enough that these don't fit with the new aesthetic due to them being way too thin when compared to the bulky torso. Now I've got to deal with them actually being nearly broken upon receiving it. Come to think of it, it is weird how they worked on Starscream but not Sandstorm, maybe because the balance between slender and bulky is far too skewed in this instance, if that makes any sense. It probably doesn't, but then again the whole execution of this figure doesn't either. Conceptually, this release is one to be celebrated. G2 is finally getting the respect it deserves after all these years, yet for some reason it just seems like everything to do with this mold has been bogged down with laziness, from the engineering to the paint job to the retooling to even the idea of taking a classic transformation scheme and recreating it. The Seeker body type is something that has to be gotten right the first time around, otherwise you're just going to end up with tons of disappointing releases that simply won't generate as much hype as they could have. The fandom is divided on this mold. Half love it because of its accuracy to the original cartoon, whilst the other dislike it because at best it's underwhelming and at worst its generation selects Sandstorm. It's at the point where I genuinely prefer the Megatron that released beside him. Sure, he's stuck with bullshit parts forming, bonkers weapons, and abysmal head design, and he even shares the illness with Sandstorm of damaged parts out of the box. But at least the articulation works properly, the paint is done crisply, and he actually feels like a complete toy. It's probably why Australia didn't even bother stocking Sandstorm to begin with. Yes, in most instances EB Games and Amazon get most selects releases, but Sandstorm seemed to run by for some reason. Even when you remove the QC aspects and get a perfect figure out of the box, Sandstorm is still an underdone jet and a blandly designed, poorly built robot. I do not like the original Starscream figure. I don't hate it, but I'm annoyed by what it represents, the push for G1 accuracy over actual quality toy design. Sandstorm is the natural progression of that, and in this instance, I do actually dislike the toy. There are brief glimpses of brilliance, such as the magnificent head sculpt. Yes, it's a faux part, but the end result is lovely, but even taking those into account, he's pretty shit. I want to recommend this toy because I have a soft spot for Generation 2, but if this is the standard going forward, I just can't partake in it. But as far as Sandstorm himself goes, I don't think I can give him the lowest score possible, because that would put him on the same level as Thunder Leader and Double Dealer. And he does have his moments, like the head sculpts, and some of the chest retooling, and... yeah, I'm sorry, I got nothing beyond that. But ultimately, he's only pretty bad, not ridiculously terrible. Every part is annoying, but he does what he says on the box, and he functions as a transformer. So, I think a 2 is more appropriate. Still, it's incredibly annoying that I got duped into something like this in the first place. Over the past year, everyone was constantly saying, oh, it's a massive step up from the Starscream version, oh, the Coneheads are so much better. And I'll admit, as you've seen in this video, he does photograph extremely well. But I'm sorry, in person, it's just trash. And as such, well, that's the last Earthrise Seeker I'm gonna be taking a look at. 2 chances is honestly way more than this mold deserves. I've given way too much leeway. It doesn't matter what they release going forward, unless maybe they do a Nacelle or an Action Master Thundercracker. Those two have been waiting for a toy to be made of them regardless, so I kinda just put up with the shittiness anyway. But aside from those two, it doesn't matter. I'm done. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And at this point, there won't be a third time. Thank you very much.